Alhamdulillah, salatu wassalam ala Rasulullah wa ba'd. Yesterday, the topic is basically some of the benefits that are mentioned within the writings of Shaykh al-Islam ibn Taymiyyah rahimahullah ta'ala from his books. Every time passing by a benefit, and usually the benefit is a principle in our religion that makes things clearer, and we can refer things to these principles. So writing down these benefits is something that is very important, and it's from the ways of the people of knowledge in which they would record the benefits of what they learn from the books of the people of knowledge. And Shaykh al-Islam ibn Taymiyyah rahimahullah, he was living at a time that he faced so many of the tribulations close to what we face, with many differences and many different sects and so on. And his writings, based on the Quran and the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, and according to the understanding of the early generations of Islam, you would find these principles, which are basically guidelines to make it easy for us to understand the Quran and the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ. So I mentioned some of them, inshallah ta'ala, in some minutes, continuing from yesterday. One of the things that he said, rahimahullah, الشريعة مبناها على تحصيل المصالح وتكميلها وتعطيل المفاسد وتقليلها. This is a principle that the Sharia, the ahkam, the rules of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, is based on two things. تحصيل مصالح, meaning bringing what is benefiting and perfecting it. Two things in that one part, and two things on the other side, and pushing away harm and making it less, if it's correct to translate it like this. Meaning there are goods and there are evil things. There are good things and there are evil things. And for the Sharia, for the rules of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to be perfect, and it is perfect, it has to bring what is good, and not just to say what is good, the basics of it, it has to perfect it. And to push away what is wrong and what is evil, and to diminish it even at times when people are having to face with some form of evil. If it's not diminished or it's not terminated from its origins, at least it is decreased. So these two types of things, and each one has two things. This is basically the Sharia, the orders of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. الشريعة مبناها على تحصيل المصالح والتكميل. ليس الأمر مقتصر على تحصيل المصالح، وإنما هذه المصالح قد يتخللها الضعف أو النقص باعتبار الجانب البشري، فيأتي أو تأتي أحكام الشرع فتكمل هذا النقص. وأن الناس باعتبار المصالح وباعتبار فعل أوامر الله عز وجل على مراتب، فمنهم من في إيمانه نقص وفي عمله نقص، ومنهم من يكمل عمله. ولذلك كانت الفرائض وكانت السنن والمستحبات والحدود إلى آخره، وهذا كله من رحمة الله عز وجل بالعباد. وأن من أراد أن يترقى في مراتب الولاية والزلفى إلى الله عز وجل ما عليه إلا أن يحصل الأصل ثم يبني على ذلك ما جاء في الشرع من تكميل هذا أو هذه المصالح حتى يكمل إيمان العبد. So this is a very important point, and this is the mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that you have orders from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we have to do it. But people are in levels when it comes to the obedience of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Some people do just maybe pray the 5 daily prayers and stay away from what's haram. This is the minimum requirement, of course, and it's the mercy of Allah that within the obligations people are in levels. And then for those who want to elevate themselves and to perfect their iman, there are things in the deen. It is not just one action here or there, but it's something that would make the life of the believers a perfect way of life, of completing and perfecting their iman, and they keep on every day elevating themselves by completing the iman and bringing these great benefits. And that's why for those who start practicing the deen of Islam, if they would do it the right way, one day after another it's totally different than the day before. 1 year is different than the year before, and they keep on accumulating these goodness, elevates their iman. They would make them taste the sweetness of iman, and their state changes because of these masalih, these benefits that they keep accumulating. Some people, they spend their whole life struggling in just fulfilling the basics or the obligations. There are, in both there is goodness, but of course it would make a big difference once the person perfect and complete his iman. On the other side, على الجانب الآخر، إن هذه الشريعة المطهرة الكاملة فيها تعطيل المفاسد وتقليلها. تعطيل المفاسد أي باعتبار المحرمات. إذا حرم الله عز وجل شيئا فهذا الأمر الشرعي من الله عز وجل يقتضي من أهل الإيمان أن تنتفي عنهم صفة أو عقد الإصرار على معصية الله عز وجل. إذا وقع الواحد منهم في معصية الله تبارك وتعالى بغلبة نفس أو شهوة، سرعان ما يعود ويرجع إلى الله عز وجل فيكمل إيمانه. وهذه المفاسد باعتبار الفرد واعتبار المجتمع تأتي أوامر الله تبارك وتعالى وشرع الله عز وجل الكامل فينفي عن المجتمع إذا ما قام الناس دين الله عز وجل، ينفي عنهم المفاسد في مجملها. وإن وجد الإنسان في زمان أو في مكان غلب عليه الفساد، لا يقال أن الشرع إنما يكون في حال كمال فحسب، بل يتأكد في حقه أنه إن لم يستطع انتفاء أو نفي الفساد بالكلية فيجب عليه أن يسعى في تقليلها. That on the other side, the things that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala forbade us from doing to the individual or to the society in general, if the rules of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala are applied, then it should terminate and eliminate the evil if people would apply it in the proper way. And of course it doesn't mean that people will be perfect. People would fall into mistakes, but also the deen of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has something to do with these people, those who would break the laws and those who would commit sins and so on. And if a person commits a sin and immediately repents to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that is the path of completing one's iman. But if a person is in an environment or a place where there's evil no matter what, does that mean that the Sharia or the rules of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does not have a place in such an environment or such a time? Of course not. Why? Because it's the seal of all messengers is the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and this is the perfect way of life. So even in whatever situation the person is in, there is something in the deen of Islam, if not to eliminate the evil, is to decrease it. And it doesn't mean that it approves it, but it's something that a person has to make sure that he's doing his best. And this is by itself is a principle that many of the rulings of the religion of Islam based on these two things, and each one has two, the perfection and the basics and the perfection, and when it comes to the fasad or the evil, to eliminate it completely or to decrease it. And based on that, many of the things that many people don't understand the sayings of the people of knowledge when it comes to applying this. So this is a principle that shows the perfection of the deen of Islam in brief. You can give lectures based on this simple principle. Also, he said, and again this is not in any form of an order, just some benefits that if we have them, if we write them down, if we remember them, it helps so much in clarifying many of the things. He says, ليس في المعقول ما يناسب المنقول. ليس في المعقول ما يناسب المنقول. هناك معقول وهناك منقول. المعقول يعني باعتبار العقل البشري القاصر، ما يعقله الناس على اختلاف مشاربهم، والناس باعتبار المعقول لا حد له، وكل إنسان له عقله وله نظرته وله رأيه وله ذوقه إلى آخره، ويختلف باختلاف البيئة والزمان والمكان والتربية إلى أمور كثيرة جدا لا تنحصر، ولا يمكن أن تنضبط أحوال الناس على مجرد المعقول. ولذلك الفساد الحاصل في هذه الدنيا ما وقع إلا بسبب تكبر الناس على المنقول، أي الشرع المطهر الكامل، أي الكتاب والسنة، وتقديمهم للمعقول والهوى والرأي والذوق على فهمهم وعلمهم القاصر، يقدمون ذلك على أمر الله عز وجل المعصوم من الخطأ والزلل. فلذلك جاء الشرع يبين أن المعقول ليس فيه ما يناسب المنقول حتى يلجأ الناس إلى الله تبارك وتعالى ويقدم المنقول، أي الوحي الشرع المطهر الكتاب والسنة، حتى وإن خالف المعقول، حتى وإن خالف العقول. وهذا أصل من أصول أهل السنة أن النقل يقدم على العقل. هذه الكلمات اليسيرة تسهل على المسلم أن يحفظ مثل هذه الأصول، ومن ثم يعبد ربه تبارك وتعالى وفقها. فالكتاب والسنة وحي من الله عز وجل يقدمان ولا شك على عقول الناس وآراء الناس وزبالات أفكار الناس، لأن هذا وحي مطهر قد طهره الله عز وجل وهو وحي من الله عز وجل. The statement is that there is nothing in the intellect that is in يناسب المنقول حمك الله, meaning that would be comparable to the text, meaning to the wahy, to the revelation from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. You have two things. You have the desires of the people, you have their intellect, their understanding, their opinions, their likings and so on, and you have the protected revelation wahy from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And these two things, it depends on what people are, they always get against each other in many cases. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants from us to put forward what, not our own minds, but to put forward the pure and protected wahy, revelation from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And this is the purpose of the wahy. Otherwise, if it's according to what people think, then there is no need for the messengers of Allah. People can figure it out, can figure out how to eat, how to drink, how to earn money. These things, they figure that out, and you don't have to have a messenger from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, a wahy from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to teach people how to eat food and to take care of their health and things like this. But why the people are in need of the messengers of Allah, in need of the wahy, more than they need eating and drinking? Because what's in the wahy, it's something that they won't figure it out based on their own intellect alone. They need the wahy from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Based on their intellect, they can figure out that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the creator of all things. But they won't figure out that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the one that is worthy of worship, because shayateen works in this field, and they would make them have intercessions. The mind would say, how can we turn to the Most High alone, immediately like this, directly? We need to have something in between us and Him. This is the ma'qul, this is their own intellect or their own understanding, right? So they can say out of respect, they can say out of many things. So we need to have something as intercessors between us, images of righteous people, things of that nature. They use their own mind, and this is all wrong and it's all false, right? And people can debate based on their own minds, but the revelation, the wahy from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala comes to refute that it's not according to what you think, it's according to what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants from you. And many examples. And as Ali radiallahu anhu, the famous statement of Ali radiallahu anhu about wiping over the khuf, he said, لو كان الدين بالرأي لكان مسح أسفل الخف أولى من أعلى، أو كما قال رضي الله عنه. If the deen was to be taken by our own opinions and intellect, then wiping the khuf should be done on the bottom of it, not the top of it, right? Because this is what you would step on the ground, that means it might get dirty, so this is what you need to wipe if you think with your own mind. But the wahy comes to wipe over it, on top of it, because we are nothing but slaves of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And the goal is not about cleaning physically, it's the goal about being a slave of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And the same thing when it comes to wudu. What's the purpose of the wudu? Is it to physically clean ourselves? This is one of the wisdoms behind it. But if a person says, I'm perfectly clean, I just came out of whatever means of cleaning, would that be valid for him? It's not valid unless he makes wudu, unless he would do that with the proper intentions and the proper way, and so on. So, al-manqul, or what comes to us from the text, from the revelation of Allah, the Quran and the Sunnah, something that should be done and clear in the heart of every Muslim, that it's not to be against our own intellect, it's not to be presented first to our own minds and opinions, and then accordingly our submission will be. No, our submission has to be immediate and fully. Why? Because this is the words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the Most High, the creator of the heavens and the earth. So how can that be less than what the people with their deficiencies might think? This is another principle. It's a principle, and we can witness that in many of the things in our life. And many of the deficiencies that people have is because of this. They will talk about things, but we are now in a different environment, or this or that. When the manqul, when the text, when the wahy from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is in such a way, it is not just 1400 years ago, it's something to be till the day of judgment, because it does not deal about which type of car you drive, or what type of things that you do in materialistic ways of life. It deals with things that does not happen except by the wahy from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, which matters of ibadah, halal, haram, things of that nature. So we have to be careful with this result. ذلك يقول العادة تمنع أن يقرأ قوم كتابا في فن من العلم كالطب والحساب ولا يستشرحوه، فكيف بكلام الله الذي هو عصمتهم وبه نجاتهم وسعادتهم وقيام دينهم ودنياهم. He's saying that العادة, or the way that people have in their natural understanding, that it prevents that people would read a book in any of subject of knowledge like medicine or math and they don't ask for explanation to it. This is not what people do. People ask for explanation of books of math, books of medicine. So he's saying, how about the words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that in the words of Allah is their salvation, and this is how they are saved, and their happiness and the establishment of their deen and their dunya is according to what's in the book of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So how come people don't ask for the explanation of the Quran? How come people do not seek this knowledge of getting to know what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants from them, when they do not do the same when it comes to the books of the materialistic knowledge that they need to have? The most important book in our life is the book of Allah, the Quran. فدل ذلك على أن المسلم ينبغي أن يحرص على أن يتعرف على مراد الله عز وجل منه في كلامه سبحانه وتعالى وفي سنة النبي عليه الصلاة والسلام، وأن هذا من آكد ما ينبغي على المسلم أن يهتم به. لماذا؟ لأنه الكتاب الذي فيه عصمة العبد ونجاته كما سمعنا وسعادته وقيام دينه في الدنيا والآخرة. فإذا لم يتعرف على مراد الله عز وجل منه وقع في الزلل ووقع في اتباع الهوى، فإما أن يكون متبعا للوحي المعصوم أو أنه متبع لهوى، وقد ذم الله عز وجل من اتبع هواه بغير هدى من الله. So this is by itself is a lifestyle that a person would make sure that he is constantly trying to learn what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants from him in the Quran and in the Sunnah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, because this is the path of happiness. And it's either a person would follow his desires or follow the revelation from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, either or. There is no third category. So as a result of that, a person would be so much concerned that if he's not following the wahy, if he does not have that knowledge to follow the wahy, the revelation from Allah, that means he's following his own desires, and following the desires has been condemned in the Quran, and this is the path of destruction in this life and in the hereafter. Another point, and inshallah a few minutes and I'll stop inshallah ta'ala. He says, الصراط المستقيم أن يفعل العبد في كل وقت ما أمر به في ذلك الوقت من علم وعمل ولا يفعل ما نهي عنه. الصراط المستقيم, the straight path that we all want to be on, we all want to be steadfast on. And any Muslim, if he's asked this question, would you like to be steadfast on the Sirat al-Mustaqim, he would never say no. He would say yes. But why we're not, or some people, or whatever happens that a person is not steadfast on the Sirat al-Mustaqim, and there's so much struggle because part of it people do not understand how to be steadfast on the Sirat al-Mustaqim. And another thing is when it comes to actions and being patient and knowing and having the certainty in the rewards from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that makes people away from the Sirat al-Mustaqim. الصراط المستقيم هذا الصراط الذي من سار عليه وثبت عليه في هذه الدنيا فإن الله عز وجل يقيمه على الصراط المضروب على ظهر جهنم، ومن ثبت هنا فإنه يثبت هناك، ومن زل هنا فالحال أنه يزل هناك إلا أن يعفو الله عز وجل عنه. فكما أن النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم بين أن في يوم القيامة من يعبر الصراط وكلمح البصر أو كأجاويد الخيل، أو منهم من يقف مرة يمشي مرة ويكبو مرة، ومنهم من يقع على وجهه يكردس في جهنم، ومنهم من تسفعه النار إلى آخره. هذا كله إنما هي أحوال الناس في هذه الدنيا. فلما كانت أحوالهم في الدنيا ترتب على ذلك أحوالهم في الآخرة. ولذلك كان أعظم الدعاء هو دعاء سورة الفاتحة، اهدنا الصراط المستقيم. فمن هدي إلى الثبات على صراط الله المستقيم فهو الموفق السعيد. ومن تنكب الصراط فهو المخذول. نسأل الله عز وجل العافية. فكيف يستقيم العبد على صراط الله تبارك وتعالى المستقيم? So as we know that in the day of judgment, people would pass on the straight path, on the Sirat al-Mustaqim that is on top of the hellfire. We know that, and we know that people will be passing it or not passing it according to their iman and according to their actions in this life. And those who would pass on the Sirat al-Mustaqim are only the believers. The disbelievers will be in hellfire before that. The believers are the only ones that would pass on the Sirat al-Mustaqim. And they are not the same. And the Prophet ﷺ said some would pass like a blink of an eye, and some would pass like a strong wind, and some would pass like a fast horse, and so on. And decreases, and some people would walk slowly, and the more or the less speed they are, the more they are getting from the hellfire with the hooks and the fire that is affecting them. And Allahu A'lam how long it is, right? And how slow a person is according to his life in this dunya, in this life. And those who would walk and fall, and those who would fall into the hellfire completely, as the Prophet ﷺ said, from among the Muslims. How is that? It's according to how they are on the Sarat in this dunya. In this life we can see for ourselves, are we on the Sarat or not? Are we, according to what is mentioned in the hadith, being steadfast on it according to the way of the Prophet ﷺ, or we walk and fall, or is a person away from the Salat completely? So accordingly, the matter will be in the hereafter, unless Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala forgives. So it's such a serious matter because it's a continuous Salat, it's a continuous path, this life connected to the hereafter. And the final destination is the Jannah of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala made it easy for the person to see his stand and to see how to be steadfast. So how can we be steadfast on the Salat al-Mustaqim? This is such a serious question that we need to know the answer of it, and that's why the most virtuous dua in Surah, in the Quran, the most virtuous dua at all is the dua that is mentioned in the most virtuous surah, and that is Ihdina as-Salat al-Mustaqim, guide us to the straight path. And this is, if the concern is there, then we need to have the knowledge of how to be on the Salat al-Mustaqim. He says, as-Salat al-Mustaqim, what is it? أن يفعل العبد في كل وقت, that the slave of Allah do in every time what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala ordered him to do in that particular time, from knowledge and action, and he does not do what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala forbade him of doing. أن يفعل العبد في كل وقت ما أمر به في ذلك الوقت. يعني هناك وظيفة للوقت، وأن العمل الصالح مرتبط بالوقت وبالزمان وبالمكان، أن هناك عبودية لله عز وجل وأوامر لابد أن تؤدى بالنهار وتضيع على العبد إذا حل الليل، وكذلك عبودية لله عز وجل في الليل لا يقبله الله عز وجل بالنهار. وأحوال الناس تختلف، فالمتزوج يختلف عن غير المتزوج، والذي يبيع ويشتري له عبودية زائدة تختلف عمن لا يبيع ويشتري. وإذا حل شهر رمضان ففيه عبودية، إذا جاء وقت الصلاة فوظيفة الوقت أن يقوم العبد بما أمر الله عز وجل به، وإذا ما واجهته الفتن ينبغي عليه أن يقوم بدين الله عز وجل وأن يعبد الله تبارك وتعالى بمقتضى هذا الحال، أن يصبر عن معصية الله تبارك وتعالى. والإنسان في يومه وفي ليله يتعرض لأحوال كثيرة وأوقات مختلفة وأماكن كثيرة، في كل وقت وفي كل حال وفي كل مكان عبودية لله عز وجل يجب عليه أن يشهدها، ويجب عليه أن يعرف وظيفة وقته، وإلا إن لم يقع في الفساد وفي المعصية ويعرض نفسه لغضب الله عز وجل، فهو باب واسع لتضييع الحسنات بسبب عدم معرفة وظيفة الوقت. So this is such a knowledge that we need to know. We know the good deeds and we need to stay away from the bad deeds, but what to do when and where? And there's so many things that we face in our day and our night. There's time for the salah, there is time to take care of a guest, there is a fitna comes onto the person, how to deal with it. These are all acts of worship, things that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants us to do in a particular time or a particular situation, or things like this. So as a result of that, do we have this knowledge? Because it's not just to do a whole bunch of good deeds according to our own desires. No, it has a certain time. If the salah time comes, then our obligation is to do the salah at that particular time. If the night comes, there are certain ibadat that we're supposed to do during the day that we misses it if the night comes. And if the night finishes, there are certain ibadat that we missed that we cannot do if the night is finished, and so on. So having this knowledge is such an important thing, because if a person doesn't know that, he might fall into the sins and disobeying Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And if the person knows what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants from him, or if a person saves himself from the sins, he might fall into doing what is less reward than others. And he, in both cases, he's in loss, right? A person buying and selling, if he buys or if he sells with no loss, this is good, mashallah. But someone else is selling with a great profit. Major difference. So this is where the people of knowledge, their elevation in the good deeds is in this point. وهذا الباب الذي تفرد فيه أهل العلم عن غيره، وهو معرفة وظيفة الوقت والترقي في مراتب أفضل العمل في أفضل حال وأفضل وقت، وهذا يحتاج ولا شك إلى علم. And as a simple example, the Prophet ﷺ, when people were fasting and they were traveling, some was fasting and some was not fasting, and we know fasting is a good deed. And it was a very hot day that the narrator of the hadith, he said that it's so hot that if a person have a shade on his head, he is such a fortunate one. And whenever they stopped while they were traveling to relax for some time, فلما نزلوا وحطوا الركاب إلى آخره فوقع الصائمون. The fasting people fell on the ground because of how much tired they are. وقام المفطرون, and the not fasting people, they took care of setting the tents and taking care of things and bringing the food and everything, right? And the fasting people, they have no power whatsoever to do that. The Prophet ﷺ, after seeing that, he said, ذهب المفطرون اليوم بالأجر, which means the non-fasting people, they surpassed everybody by the rewards today, right? This is not a principle that at all times the non-fasting people, they're having more rewards than the fasting people. This is an exception. The norm is fasting is definitely, person fasting is better than someone that is not fasting. But seeing the benefits and the losses, especially if it's an optional fasting, who will be able to judge this? Someone that needs to have the knowledge, right? And not something that it becomes whispers of shaitan, or you need to do that, fasting will be difficult, then leave fasting when it's not that difficult or when it's not that important, whatever a person deciding. So it's a point that it needs knowledge to get to know maratib al-a'mal, the levels of deeds, and that's why there's obligations, there's recommended, there's haram, and so on. So to be on the salat al-mustaqim is to know what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants from us in all of our affairs. I guess this is good enough so that we don't keep you late. Inshallah, we'll continue. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give us life tomorrow. Wa sallallahu wa sallam wa barak ala Muhammad.